Monday morning, I got a call from Bob up at the machine shop letting me know that he had lost one of the clips that holds the wrist pins in, so I was burning up the phone lines looking for this specific set of clips. And Uncle Terry at Jegg's thought he may have some in a set of pistons at the 11th Avenue store. So I drove in there to check things out and see what he had. But unfortunately, the set that he had weren't the right ones. I appreciate you, Uncle Terry. You tried. So I struck out there at the 11th Avenue store. However, I still needed to run up to Delaware to the main warehouse to pick up a new set of push rods. Bob wants to increase the push rod length to 7.450 inches, and thankfully they had a set up in Delaware. Once I had the push rods in hand, it was time to turn and burn back to Bob's shop, about an hour drive one way from Delaware to Mount Vernon. And unless a miracle happens, I'm probably going to have to leave Bob's and go straight to Summit to pick up those wrist pin clips. Unfortunately, about halfway to Bob's shop, the weather started to turn sour. It was starting to spit snow just enough to wet the roads down. As I made my way east from Delaware to Mount Vernon, I drove out from underneath of it and beat it to Bob's shop. Thankfully, when I got there at about 3:30, Bob had some good news for me. One of the guys that works in the machine shop for Bob had found that wrist pin clip, so Bob was able to go ahead and finish assembling the short block. As I mentioned in an earlier video, Bob had gone ahead and zero-decked the block to get as much compression out of this engine as we possibly could. Once Bob had the short block completed, it was time to start checking valve train geometry and double-checking the push rod length. Bob sets up one intake and one exhaust valve using checking springs, which are extremely lightweight coil springs. That makes it really easy to turn the engine over and examine how the roller tip sweeps across the top of the valve stem. Next, it was time to degree the camshaft in, according to the cam card sent with the camshaft from Iski. Bob uses a Cloy's adjustable cam gear, and he Loctites the bolts in place after the camshaft is degreed in. The next step is to set cam end play at about 2.5 thousandths of an inch. At this point, it was just about time for everybody to head home, and the weather outside was getting worse by the minute. So I'm definitely thankful old LT found that Jesus clip for us. Well, LT, you saved the day today.
The Jesus clip.
What you were saying Jesus about, huh?
Don't you ever notice that? You know, when something flies away, it's like, Jesus!
Your keen eye picked it up over there. Bob thought it was gone forever. Clear across the shop.
25 feet away.
I thought for sure it'd be somewhere besides where it was at.
Well, I'm sure glad you found it because it saved me a trip driving clear to Summit.
Oh, you can drive it.
Yeah.
I had one coming.
You had one coming?
I had one coming tomorrow.
Well, I didn't know that at the time. I was...
Just for this little clip?
Yeah, for that little clip.
Where you doing it now? Where is
It's
it at?
already in the engine, LT.
Oh, you done put it in. I didn't watch him put it in. Wow.
It's got all 8 cylinders full now.
Ready to rock.
He had one of them missing. I was headed clear back to Akron, Canton if we couldn't find it. But thankfully,
Only for Uncle Bob.
LT to the rescue. Me, Bob, and LT hung out in the shop for a little while I let the 64 warm up, and then it was time for everybody to head home. Luckily, it's only about a 2-minute drive for Bob as he lives right up the road from the shop. I, on the other hand, have a 45-minute drive one way, but I managed to pass most of that time talking to Billy on the way home about what they had gotten done today on the Mustang while I was up at Bob's. Billy had compiled a list of parts that the car needed and then made his own trip into Jegg's to see Uncle Terry, who got him all fixed up.
Spark plug wires, wheel spacers, ceramic boots, fuel line fittings, and spark plug separator.
Kenny, Rob, and Billy got most of that stuff done yesterday, but they plan on finishing up the rest of it on Tuesday. Thankfully, the weather is better today, but it's extremely windy and cold. Vicky had the pellet stove going in the living room, and the dogs were quite content to stay right where they were. But I need to head to Bob's. Since the salt trucks have got the roads all salted, I decided to take the dually up to Bob's today instead of the 64. While it's warming up out back, I fired up the furnace in the shop and got things warmed up out there for the kids. I can't wait for winter to be officially over and be done with all this snow. Thankfully, the days are getting longer and the temperature on average is getting warmer, and it won't be long before our local track will be open and we can start testing down there. But for the next few weeks, we're most likely going to have to travel south if we want to get any testing in before we head to Texas. Regardless of what the weather is, I don't even have oil pressure yet. But I don't think it's going to be much longer. When I got to Bob's, he already had the heads on, the valves adjusted, and he was laying a bead of silicone across the block at each end of the lifter valley in preparation to put the intake manifold on. Once he had the intake manifold bolted down, he went ahead and shot some oil in all the rocker arms before he put the valve covers on and bolted the lift plate on top of the intake manifold and removed the engine from the engine stand so he could finish installing the oil galley plugs as well as the frost plugs and the cam plug in the back of the block. At this point, the next thing we need to do is get the engine moved into the dyno room. Bob uses a shop crane to pick the engine up off the table and set it on the dyno stand, and then wheels it into the dyno room. Once the dyno's engine stand is bolted to the dyno itself, we can start rolling the engine over with the starter and priming the engine, checking for oil pressure and making sure that we're getting oil to all the rocker arms through the push rods and the lifters. Once that was taken care of, Bob starts working on bolting the headers up to the engine, as well as connecting all the exhaust gas temperature probes so that we can record and monitor the exhaust gas temperature of each cylinder once we start the engine on the dyno. We're going to fire it up with Bob's 1050 ATM gas carburetor, and then we'll switch it over to E85 once we get a few heat cycles on the engine. The last thing we have to do before we can start this entire process is hook the coolant system up to the engine and fill the block with water, and of course top off the fuel cell with a little bit of race gas. After double checking all the connections, it was finally time to turn the fuel pump on and fill the carburetor full of gas and check for leaks. I went ahead and primed the accelerator pumps by hand and made sure everything was good to go before Bob turned the ignition on and hit the starter. The Malibu's engine drew its first breath at 4:54 p.m. Tuesday afternoon. As the engine sat there and ran and warmed up, Bob wanted to make sure he had all the air out of the coolant system, and I double-checked the ignition timing and set it at 34 degrees. The little small block sounded really good. Bob monitors the oil pressure and oil temperature as the engine warms up, and he's really happy with what he's seeing. With the oil temperature up to 145 degrees, the engine idles with 77 pounds of oil pressure. Bob likes to fire these engines up without even so much as a breather in the valve cover so that he can easily monitor crankcase pressure and any problems with the rings seating in as the engine warms up. So that brings us to Wednesday morning. The plan for today is to make some dyno pulls on the new engine and maybe with a little luck, bring it home. So before I left the shop, I loaded up both my carburetors and all my tuning supplies, 2 jugs of fuel and an engine cradle just in case we actually get everything done today and I can bring the engine home. After a quick pit stop at the Marathon station to top off the fuel tanks in the 64, it was time to head north up through Granville to go see Bob. I spoke to him on the phone and let him know I was on my way, and he explained to me that he wants to start the engine up on gas this morning, warm it up, and then make a pull with his gas carburetor on it before we empty the tank and switch it over to E85. Now everybody knows that today is going to be dyno day at the shop, and Bob's got a couple of guys that work for him up there, and they get pretty excited about dyno days listening to those engines scream in the back of the shop. Nick is a mechanic and he works for Bob on his days off from the firehouse, but in between projects he's usually stirring shit with LT, Bob's helper back in the machine shop. Since LT saved the day this week finding that Jesus clip, I decided to take up for him and stir Nick up this morning pretty good. Are you working today?
Never.
I'm trying to get some action shots of you and all you're doing is sitting in this chair. Now Nick is anything but quiet unless the camera's rolling. But my little jab got him out of that chair and he jumps up on the forklift to try to act like he's going to do something today. In this case, he's moving Mountain Dew bottles. Anyway, after I got Nick stirred up, Bob and I went back to the dyno room and started warming up my small block, getting ready to make some pulls. The little small block sounded really good making the pull, and the very first pull on gas netted us 547 horsepower. What do you think, Uncle Bob?
What's wonderful, oil pressure started out in the low 90s and climbed to 105 at the top. The oil temperature was hung in right at 158 clear throughout the pool. And it only lost 10 horse even between the top number and when I stopped at 6,900.
This sounds really good.
The EGTs was all right at, in the top here was mid 1100s. At the top it was 1150 as an average.
It's pretty good.
That's just, I don't know how we can do any better.
So far with the new heads and intake, we've already made 9 more horsepower on gas than it made last time on E85. So with that first pull out of the way, it's time to swap Bob's gas carburetor out for my 750 E85 carburetor, and I want to dyno the engine with the nitrous kit and everything installed exactly the way it sits when it's on the car. Bob and I go ahead and flush the fuel out of the fuel cell and the lines and get ready to start it up. All right, so we've got the 750 ATM carburetor on. We're going to start with the 750, then we'll move up to the 950. We started out with that 1050 gas ATM carburetor. We switched to Ignite Red, 750 carburetor, see what it does. In the past, everything I've ever switched from gas to E85 has made considerably more power. We're about to find out if that holds true, even using a smaller carburetor. Once we had the engine fired up, I made a couple little changes to the idle mixture screws and to the idle speed, and Bob went through and snugged up all the EGT probes in the headers just to make sure we got good readings. Bob's never used this carburetor on his dyno, so he wants to keep extra close eye on what's going on when he pulls the handle wide open. Even though my 750 carburetor is considerably smaller than Bob's gas carburetor, the dyno shows 565.8 horsepower and 528 foot-pounds of torque at the same RPM it made peak power at on gas.
See what the EGTs did. So,
It's right there.
Yeah, it's right there. We're just a tad colder with this combination on EGT temps than we was the other one. Oil pressure exactly the same. Oil temperature was 145. I think we were a little higher on the last one, but we have consecutive pulls.
Unfortunately, Bob and I's schedules only allow for so much time today to dyno this engine. And we've got time to make one more pull with the 950 carburetor on it and see how much, if any, difference it makes over the 750. What do you think, Bob? Sound better? It always does sound better on that 950. I don't know why. What'd it go?
565 at 6,300.
Don't matter, does it?
Doesn't matter.
Made the same power. It sounds better,
It sounds better.
but it makes the same power. After that third pull, it was time to go ahead and pull the engine off the dyno and get it strapped down onto an engine cradle and load it in the back of the 64 so I can get it home, get it painted, and get it put in the car.
Until the next time.
As soon as I started to pull the truck out of Bob's shop, I made a phone call to Uncle Bucko and Rob, and of course Kenny Powers, to let them know the 421 is finally headed home. The plan is to get this thing back to my shop and get it unloaded, put it on an engine stand, and get it painted as quickly as possible so that the paint can set up overnight. So I drove from Bob's shop straight down to Buckeye Lake to see Mark and pick up everything I needed to get this thing painted.
Where have you been?
Huh?
Where have you been?
Working.
Well, whatever.
Blowing shit up.
Yeah. Hopefully you're going the other direction now.
Well, I'm trying my best.
I hope so. Jeez. I swear.
Mark hasn't hardly seen hide nor hair out of me or Jeremy in the last few weeks. So he came out to see the engine, and then we went in to box up all my painting supplies. You missing my brother?
No. No, I'm not. No.
Well, things are getting rolling again now,
Well,
so
I figured, yeah.
I'll be sending Buckwheat back down here to visit.
Yeah, I'm sure he's going to be rearing his ugly head again.
So Mark's had his advance warning. Once I get this Malibu back together, it'll be time to get everything ready to start racing season again, and Buckwheat will be back at A1 Auto Parts on the regular. Anyway, when I got back to the house, Jeremy, Kenny, and Rob were all standing by waiting to help me get this engine unloaded and start getting it masked up so we can get it painted this evening. After the cold trip home in the back of the 64, Rob used a heat gun to put a little heat in the block, and then Kenny cleaned everything up, masked it, and started in with a coat of primer, and then put down 3 coats of Chevy orange. Kenny's very particular about his engine paint jobs, and he made me promise not to touch the engine or unmask it until he came back Thursday morning. Jeremy and Kenny went ahead and unloaded the Malibu out of the trailer first thing, moved it into the garage, and unmasked the engine to get it ready to put in the car. But they had to make a call down to Mark's to get some motor mount bolts.
You know it's bad when I'm here.
Evidently, my original motor mount bolts were too long for the Motown block.
Where's Uncle Bucko at?
He had to go down to his house to get some
Aw, I
special
missed
bolts.
him.
Jeremy always finds a reason to go home in the middle of the day. Usually it's an excuse to go take a shit on my time.
Find bolts that I bagged and tagged that you lost.
Kenny did 20 minutes ago when you left to go to your house on a 5-minute run to go get them.
I had to go look.
You went down there to take a shit.
Maybe.
So now that everyone is here and everything we need is here, it's finally time to start lowering this thing down in the car. Mark hung out and supervised for about 15 minutes before he had decided he'd had enough. You had enough?
I had enough.
I don't blame you.
It's the best series of motor installation I've ever seen in my entire life.
Once the guys started lowering the engine down in the car, it only took about 30 minutes to get on the engine mounts and get it bolted up to the bell housing. The nitrous kit was already bolted to the intake and the distributor was still in it from when we had it on the dyno. Thankfully, Kenny was here the day we took it apart and he had bagged and tagged every nut and bolt that came out of this car. That made it really easy for everybody to get it put back together and find all the pieces and parts. One of the last projects was putting the exhaust back on and putting the torque converter bolts back in the transmission. At this point, we're only about 30 minutes away from firing this engine up in the car for the first time. The guys were getting excited. Well, Robbie was. Jeremy, not so much. I got in the car and turned the key on to make sure everything powers up the way it's supposed to. Before I cranked the engine over, I went ahead and put the transmission in park, and then the guys checked for leaks as I cranked the engine over to fill the carburetor full of fuel. The mechanical fuel pump only took a few seconds to fill it up. Then it was time to start filling the coolant system, and that's when we found our first major roadblock. Unfortunately, the Motown block doesn't have a provision for the water pump bypass that's built into the water pump. So we had to pull the water pump back off, thread and tap the bypass port, and plug it, put the water pump back on, and finish refilling the cooling system with water. After we checked for leaks, it was finally time to hit the key and hear the Malibu run for the first time. I double-checked the ignition timing and readjusted the carburetor idle speed, and voila, the old Malibu is back in business. Once the thermostat opened, we went ahead and topped off the cooling system and then ran it up on the lift to check for leaks. Once everything checked out, it was finally time to go ahead and put the hood back on the car. All right, guys, so it's Thursday night. Malibu's back. It's starting to rain right now, and tomorrow it's supposed to rain all day, which is good because that'll wash all this salt off the roads. Hopefully, maybe this weekend we can start testing again. I did take it around the block, as you saw in the video. It runs really, really good. It actually sounds a little bit different, and I'm not really sure why it sounds so much different this time, but it definitely sounds better. I drove it around the block and got on it one time, and I can definitely tell it gets to 7,000 RPM a little faster. It throws the car around like a rag doll. This 3,800 pound car, it's just like, it weighs nothing. Bob did a wonderful job. It only took 2 weeks to put another engine together for this thing, and you know, we reused the crank and the rods, the cam, the lifters, and that's about it. Everything else is new. So I figure everybody's going to want to just hear the thing run for a minute, and the ignition timing's set and it's all good. I'll go ahead and fire it up for you. All right, guys, so I'm back out here in the shop. It's, I think it's Friday night. This week, the last week, from Monday on has just been a lot. Anybody who has ever lost an engine and completely replaced it within 2 weeks will tell you it's just a tremendous amount of time, work, chasing parts, and gathering everything up and taking it all to the machine shop and making sure you've got everything up there that you need, and then making sure you get everything brought back home that you need, and then getting the engine back in the car and having a different block, and some of the bolts are different, some of the fittings are different. So it's just been a monumental task to get that car back together. I'm exhausted. I'm very tired. Trying to make a video out of what we did this week and have it be something that someone will watch is very difficult. I have a very short attention span. Something has to be like really, really good to hold my attention. And I think you probably see some of that in my videos, the way I edit them and the way I put them together. It has to hold my attention, or else I don't think it'll hold anyone's attention. Maybe that's not the case. I don't know. But I want to thank Bob and everybody up at the machine shop. I definitely want to thank everybody up at TrickFlow who helped me out getting those heads and that intake manifold. Obviously want to thank Billy and Rob and Kenny and Uncle Bucko for helping me get that car back together. I hope everybody enjoys this video. I thank you guys for watching, liking, sharing, subscribing, all that. Billy's getting ready to head home. They've been working on his truck out here. There's just been a lot going on this week, and there's just been too much to try and cover and keep up with. But I'm back. The Malibu's back. Things are going to start getting better now. The weather's coming too.